She made her sit like a grown woman. She pressed the chair back against the kitchen tile and told the child to keep still as the sun caught on a long braid, the last ribbon of a life the little girl could still touch. The scissors gleamed in Patricia's hand, bright and clinical, and for a moment the kitchen smelled only of coffee and something colder, a quiet that behaves like a decision. Ana Clara was 11. She wore her memories the way some children wear a favorite blanket, folded into the sweep of hair that her mother had once braided every night, fingers moving in a small, sure rhythm. That hair was a map of voices she could no longer hear. It was how she called the deceased woman back into a room that had become too empty. To Ana Clara, it wasn't vanity. It was an anchor. Outside, the town simmered under a human mourning. Inside the little house, the air was thicker. Rogerio, the father, left for work earlier that day with his lunchbox and a promise to return by noon. He believed, perhaps foolishly, that the household could be mended in time. A new life with a new wife would fit around the edges of the loss. Patricia had walked into their lives with steady opinions and a tidy anger that often confused itself for order. Where Rogerio had tolerated softness, she preferred firmness. Where Ana Clara kept a photograph and a braid, Patricia saw a tether to a past that made her uncomfortable. This was the place where the morning split. Patricia's voice, when it came, was small and sharp. "You must cut it," she said, an order dressed as concern. "It's time she looks like the rest of the family." Ana Clara's hands tightened around the braid as if she could hold a memory like a rope. She said softly, "Mom used to braid it like this." Her voice trembled like a bell barely struck. It was the sort of sentence that carries more than its words. And Patricia, looking down, saw only defiance where there was grief. There was no argument worth the scrape of voices. The scissors were taken from the drawer the way a verdict is taken from a judge, thin, unquestionable. Patricia sat her down, set the heavy tailor shears in her lap, and steadied the little girl's chin. The first snip made a sound like a small animal startled in the house, metallic, decisive. Hair fell like brown petals to the tile. The cut was short in time, but long in consequence. It was not a physical violence that needed to be described in angle or blood. It was a theft of a memory, an erasure made visible. The braid separated from the scalp from the stories braided into it, stories of bedtime prayers and songs hummed half asleep, and lay in a small heap at Ana Clara's feet. She watched as if her hands were on someone else's body. This is not a story of a public courtroom. It is the private kind of cruelty that wears a polite face. Yet in the hush after the scissors echo, something changed in the room that had nothing to do with human schedules or excuses.
A warmth settled over Ana Clara's shoulder. Not wind, not the heat from the stove, but a calm that made the place behind her neck ache with a peculiar relief. It was like the memory of a hug arriving late. On the side table, the family Bible, an object of Rogerio's that he left open on the same page most nights like a sleeping animal, shifted. It did not fall in a theatrical clatter. Instead, the pages eased apart, and the book lay open as if someone invisible had set a finger upon the margin. The words there were not meant for voices raised in the kitchen, yet the book turned itself toward the light and revealed a verse about God noticing the low and the forgotten. No trumpet sounded, no heavenly trumpet. That kind of spectacle is not this story's currency. Rather, a quiet reading of truth took place in the hush between human breaths. Patricia's hand froze for an instant over the fallen braid. She felt, without naming it, a presence that watched. Shame is a slow thing. It starts as a draft along the spine and settles in the face. At first, she pushed the sensation away. She told herself this action was necessary, corrective even. Her thoughts lined up like soldiers. Children must fit, family must present, the past cannot be allowed to haunt a new marriage. But beneath her reasoning, someone else in her chest stirred, an awareness that perhaps the child's hair was not just appearance, not a symbol of defiance, but a home for something sacred she didn't understand. If you believe Jesus defends the vulnerable, type Jesus sees in the comments. The simple invitation hung as a second kind of witness, both the invisible presence that had leaned close to Ana Clara and the neighbors who, through thin walls and habit, had gathered the fragments of the morning like they would make a pattern. Donna Norma, who lived 2 houses down with a small porch and a tendency to hang a basin outside at dawn, had seen the child come out that week with braided hair and had guessed the rest. She knew the look of a girl carrying absence.
In a town like theirs, where everyone's business walks on the same paths, what happens in one yard often passes through 3 porches before noon. Inside the kitchen, after the snip, Ana Clara's cheeks were wet, and she held her hairless crown as if it could still hold a story. Her fingers moved over her scalp as though turning the pages of a book only she could read. She said nothing that would inflame the room. Her grief did not need to be explained. It simply settled there like dust, visible and impossible to smooth away. Patrícia straightened, the air between her ribs tight with a scolding that had been planted by upbringing and watered by insecurity. "I did what's best for you," she said, voice rougher now, as if she were trying on toughness like a new coat. "You cannot live in the past forever." There was a human logic to her words, but it did not comfort. Rogerio's absence made them reverberate.
He was a man who thought provision meant more than presence. He believed a roof and a job could rebuild the fragments of a family. He had not meant to leave his daughter with this kind of correction. The first ripple of the supernatural was subtle, a blame-free temperature, a hush around the child's shoulders that felt like an answered prayer without words. Ana Clara looked up then, and in her eyes there was an acknowledgement, innocent and absolute, that someone else had looked too. She whispered, "I'm not alone," the way one might discover a light in an attic after fumbling in the dark. Her voice was not triumphant. It was a small, trembling recognition. Patrícia laughed under her breath, a short bark. She called the child's feeling foolishness and called it attention-seeking. But the room refused to be contained by explanations. A draft threaded through the kitchen, though the windows stayed stubbornly shut. The Bible's thin pages fluttered like a bird deciding where to land, and a soft glow gathered at the place where the book lay open, bathing the children's table in a warmth that did not belong to the mid-morning sun. A neighbor, passing by to collect her own washing, paused at the gate and peered in. Donna Norma crossed the street, slow but decisive, with the kind of curiosity that is also a kind of care in small towns. She had been watching Ana Clara from the moment she first noticed the braid. She had seen how the girl touched it and remembered. Now, with hair on the tile like fallen leaves, Marma's face tightened. She looked not at Patrícia with immediate accusation, that was not her way, but at Ana Clara with the kind of pity that made words crowd at the throat and failed to form. Patrícia's unease hardened into irritation. "What are you doing here?" she snapped at Norma, as if the older woman's presence was an intrusion into an argument she had already resolved. Norma did not answer much beyond a small, "ain't right," and the look she gave the house said more than a lecture could. She sat at the edge of the stoop, hands clasped, and from there watched the kitchen like someone watching a bruise forming under the skin. Inside, Ana Clara moved away from the table and toward the narrow stair that led to her room. She wanted nothing more than a corner and a quiet little box where the world could not touch her. Patrícia, feeling the loss of dignity somewhere deeper than the cut, watched her leave as if she had performed a duty and delivered a sentence. The scissors, abandoned on the counter, seemed to catch the light and flash like an accusation. Something else happened then, something not loud, but stern. The radio on the shelf, tuned the night before to the station Rogerio light, clicked off, though no hand had touched it. The kettle that had been warming for a coffee stilled without boiling over. Small, ordinary things ceased as if to make space. The air in the house rearranged itself around Ana Clara's absence and around Patrícia's guilt.
Guilt arrived like a guest who refuses to leave. Patrícia's face changed in a slow, visible way. The color drained from her cheeks and left behind a rawness that made her eyes small and shiny. She moved to gather the hair from the floor, the gesture of her fingers awkward and hurried. She tried to tuck the pile into a napkin, as one tucks an embarrassing secret, but it refused to be hidden. The little heap sat too proud on the tile, defiant against being smoothed away. Later, when she found herself alone for a breath, Patrícia's mind did what guilty minds do. It hunted for defenses. She told herself she had saved the child from being mocked at school. She reminded herself how she had given the household rules, and how children, with their clinging to rituals, can be stubborn. She rehearsed a future in which the family looked proper, and the memories of the past were only bones to be arranged into a respectable shape. But in the same chamber of thought, there lurked the sensation of a look that saw through her reasons. Sometimes, shame has a voice that is not her own. Patrícia felt as if someone patient and grave, had turned their eyes upon her and found her wanting. It was as if the hush in the kitchen itself had weight, and she could feel the press of it like a hand on the back of her neck. When Rogerio's truck finally returned that afternoon, the town's heat made the windows steam with the breath of the day. He carried his tools in a weathered bag and a wallet that smelled faintly of the road. He hummed a tune under his breath as he climbed the walk, the small anthems men keep for themselves when they think no one is listening. His work had kept him away. There had been a new contract, an extra hour, a client with a short temper. He had meant to be home earlier, he told himself, but the work had delayed him. He had not expected that the house would change in his absence. As Rogerio opened the door, the world inside shifted subtly, the way a person might notice the wrong key in a well-known lock. The kitchen smelled faintly of hair and coffee, and something else he could not name. The Bible lay open on the side table like an accusation. The braid, no, what was left of it, rested by the trash. Ana Clara was upstairs, her small footfalls gone behind the bedroom door. He called out before he had stepped fully inside. "Ana? Honey, I'm—" His voice stopped when he saw the chair by the table, the scissors still lying there as if waiting for a hand to reach for them. He paused with one foot on the threshold, and his eyes darted to Patrícia. Her face was pale and raw in a way that made Rogerio's chest tighten. She looked like someone who had swallowed a thing and wished she had not. "What happened?" he asked, and the question was both simple and terrible. Patrícia opened her mouth but closed it, then answered in a voice that tried to gather authority and could not. "I cut it," she said. "It had to be done."
Rogerio's hands went to his belt as if to steady himself. He set his bag down slowly and came into the kitchen. He looked at the Bible, then at the pile of hair, then at his daughter's empty chair. The joyful domestic music that often lived in the corners of their home felt like a stranger in the room now. Before Rogerio could say the words that would demand the story, something in the house slid into a different temperature. The light in the kitchen gathered and softened as if someone had drawn a hand over the sun and adjusted it, and the air around Ana Clara's empty chair seemed to pulse with an attention that was not human. Patrícia's shoulders hunched. She put her hands to her face briefly, and then lowered them as if trying to make an apology with palms that were not yet ready to speak. For a brief, unmeasured moment, the presence that had leaned close to Ana Clara earlier made itself plain in the room, not by thunder or blaze, but by a calm that carried an insistence. Injustice is seen. Rogerio's first impulse was not to explode. He understood painfully and clearly that his daughter's hair was not mere decoration. In that instant his memory became a film strip, his wife's soft hands teaching a small girl to braid, dusk and a lullaby, the smell of talc and rice water. The realization of how much he had missed at home, how absence had allowed another voice to become authority, settled on him like a rain. He turned to Patrícia. Words formed and failed. "Why would you—" he began, and the house answered with the same hush that had been larger than in ordinary silence. For the first time in months, Rogerio felt small and huge at once. Small for the things he had left unattended, huge for the decision he was about to make about the life inside these walls. Outside, someone knocked at the gate, Dona Norma's nod to the procession of news in a small town. She stood there, hand on the gate, her face turned toward the house. Her presence was not an accusation born of malice. It was firm, like an elder who has watched children and knows when a household needs the community to lean in. Rogerio looked at her, then into the kitchen, where the Bible lay open, the light gentle and focused, as if it insisted that truth be seen. Patrícia's face had now become an open map of something breaking. She did not yet fall to the floor in guilt. She did not yet speak the confession that would admit what had been more than discipline, but the beginning of shame had a sound, a small internal collapsing, and her body bore it like a weathered thing might carry a storm. He reached for the phone in his pocket, not with the intent to call work or a friend, but to name the moment for someone outside himself. He did not know whether to call a neighbor, a counselor, or the person who would help a human being carry the weight of a wrong. He stood between what had been and what must be, the house around him like a witness.
In the stairwell, behind a closed bedroom door, Ana Clara pressed the palm of her hand to the place where her mother's hands had once smoothed the braid. She tasted salt, tears, taste of childhood, and felt again the warmth that had rested on her shoulder earlier like a promise. It was not a promise of immediate undoing. It was not a vow that everything would instantly be made right. It was simply a presence that had come near and had taken note. The scene was not yet over. Patrícia's jaw worked. Rogerio was breathing through a hardness in his chest. The Bible lay open like a quiet judge. In that charged light, before a single formal confrontation had been spoken, something like a verdict had been delivered into the space. Some wrongs are too intimate to be shrugged off. Some memories cannot be cut away without the household remembering itself. And the house, which had grown used to the dull rhythms of compromise and avoidance, shuddered into attention as if remembering a name it had not spoken aloud for too long. The house held its breath, and in that quiet, Rogerio felt the weight of all the things he hadn't noticed until they broke into pieces. He climbed the stairs 2 at a time, each step a memory of an evening at home that had been traded for overtime, for a quieter life he thought he was building. He stopped outside Ana Clara's door and heard only the muffled sound of her small breathing, the soft scrape of a finger along a tender scalp. He knocked gently and pushed the door open. The room was dim, a small fortress of dolls and drawings, and the one photograph of a woman with a braid that matched the one Ana Clara had worn. The girl sat on the edge of her bed, knees drawn up, holding a small lock of hair between 2 fingers, as if that braid, even in pieces, could still tell the story of hands that once braided it. When she saw him, her face folded and then settled. There was no drama in her greeting, only the honest, raw business of a child who needed someone to make sense of the world again. Rogerio sat on the bed and met her with the kind of apology that comes first as a need rather than words. He put his hands near hers, careful to give space and to be present, and then he said simply, "I'm so sorry I wasn't here." His voice was small but steady. He did not try to fix it with explanations. He did not offer platitudes. He let his remorse be a thing she could touch. Ana Clara looked up. The warmth she had felt earlier had not gone. It hovered like a shawl around her shoulders. She smoothed the tiny braid and placed it into his palm, the way one passes a relic. "Mom used to braid it when she tucked me in," she murmured. "Can we keep it?" Her question carried the weight of someone asking permission to remember. He closed his hand over the small braid as if to protect what it signified rather than the hair itself. "Yes," he said, and meant it. "We'll keep it safe. I should have been here."
He paused, and then with a steadier breath he added, "This house won't hurt you again." Downstairs, the air had shifted into a kind of testimony. The Bible, still open where the invisible finger had turned it, lay like a petition. Patrícia sat at the kitchen table with her face hidden in her hands, the lines of her jaw unspooling. There was a sound in the house like someone clearing a throat, humiliation seeking air. She was not theatrically broken, she was quietly undone, which is sometimes worse. Guilt had a gravity of its own, and it drew others into orbit. Rogerio came down and set the braid into a small wooden box he found in the pantry, an old jewelry box, scuffed and ordinary. He carried it like a promise to the kitchen and set it between him and Patrícia. For a moment he simply looked at her, cataloging the things that had gone silent in his marriage, the small tendernesses, the patient listening, the checkpoints of a father who missed the cues. "Why did you do it?" he asked, not as a shout, but as a request that needed answering. Patrícia lifted her face. Her eyes were wet and luminous in a way that made her look suddenly smaller than the grievances she'd accumulated. A confession fled her lips before she could steady the sentences. "I thought it would help," she said. "I thought if she looked like the others, if she didn't keep living in the past, maybe we could be a family. She stopped. Shame gathered like winter fog. It made her words blunt and clumsy. "I didn't want her clinging. I thought it was right." Rogerio's jaw tightened. He had built his life on practicalities, and now he had to learn that presence matters more than provision. He thought of soft hands braiding in the dusk and the song that had once accompanied the simple choreography. He thought, too, of how easy it is for someone to mistake firmness for care. Outside, voices murmured and the neighbor's curiosity folded into concern. Donna Norma had gone to fetch a neighbor with a younger son who watched the schoolyard.
Small towns keep their own kinds of justice. Sometimes that meant someone arriving at a gate and looking in with the authority of having watched children grow. The momentum of witnesses had begun to gather, as if gravity had been turned up on human conscience. Patricia's shoulders shook. She stood and moved toward the table where the scissors still lay like a cold punctuation mark. Her hand covered them without touching. The presence in the room tightened its hold, not through noise, but by an insistence that truth be owned. She did not lash out. She leaned forward and sobbed once, long and surprised. It was the sound of someone discovering the consequences of an unexamined cruelty. Rogerio reached for her hand but then withdrew it, not wanting to confuse accountability with comfort. He needed to be a father first. "You need to leave for a while," he said, the sentence clear and steady.
Not forever, until we figure out help, until you show you'll get help, for Ana Clara's safety. Her face went blank, as if a map had been taken from her. "Leave?" she repeated, as if the word had teeth. "For now," he said, "find someone to speak to, a counselor, whoever will help you understand what happened here. You hurt her. You have to take responsibility." She nodded, a small motion of surrender. "I'll go," she whispered. "I'll go, and I'm sorry." It was apology, but it came wrapped in the admission that she needed more than regret. She needed transformation. The townspeople did not demand vigilante justice, but they did demand that the child be made safe. Someone fetched a neighbor's car. Dona Norma, who had the blunt care of someone who had raised 5 children, offered to take Patricia to her sister's house 3 towns over for a few days while the first shock settled. She would not hide wrongdoing, but she would let the family breathe under the shelter of a place that could hold the first apologies without immediate exposure. Before Patricia left, she moved toward Ana Clara in a slow, shamed orbit. Her hands trembled as she reached for the girl's shoulder, hesitant, like a stranger claiming kinship. "I'm sorry," she said, and the words fell with the weight of an admission. "I was wrong. I didn't understand what you were carrying." Ana Clara watched her for a long beat. The warmth she had felt earlier gathered again, not in the suddenness of something miraculous, but as a steadying presence that allowed a child to choose a path through hurt. She said, "I forgive you, but not the same way." Her voice was small but definite. "You have to change. You must promise to get help, and Dad has to promise to keep me safe." Rogerio nodded, tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. The promise he made was both practical and sincere. "I promise," he said. "You're not alone. I'll make sure of that." He did not speak of returning to what had been. Instead, he promised to reorient their lives so that the child would not be left to shoulder grief alone again. An aunt from Rogerio's side arrived with a gentle scolding for the man who had worked too hard at being a provider and not enough at being a father. "You made a mistake," she said, stern but tender. "Now fix it. Be here. Don't let her be alone with someone who can't see the cost of what she did." There was talk, gentle, sometimes raw, about boundaries and therapy. Rogerio listened. He made appointments for Ana Clara with a counselor who had experience with children and grief, not because a single conversation would repair everything, but because restoration is a work that needs tools. He arranged for family counseling too, a place where Patricia could reckon with the reasons behind her intervention and where they could learn to be a household that protected memory rather than erased it. In the weeks that followed, the change was neither quick nor smooth. The house learned to move with new rhythms. Rogerio shortened his hours at the job when he could and began to be present for the small, ordinary things that stitch a family back together. Reading a bedtime story slowly, learning the exact shape of his daughter's laugh, tucking a blanket across her knees. These were not grand fixes, but they mattered, and in their accumulation they began to reshape the house's interior life. Patricia, true to her promise, hitched herself to a program a counselor suggested, one that helped people understand patterns of control born from fear. It did not redeem her instantly. She called to ask how Ana Clara had slept and listened more than she spoke. There were moments of real contrition, and there were also moments where her old instincts surfaced and she stumbled. That was to expected. Change is a rocky path. The community watched with a cautious hope. Ana Clara, for her part, learned to name her feelings. In counseling, she met a woman who offered small tools, deep breaths, a box to keep memories in, stories to tell out loud so they lost their power to be secret shamed. She took the little braid that her father had kept and made a ceremony of it. They placed it in the wooden box, and together they said aloud some of the memories tied up in it: bedtime songs, a particular laugh, a scent. Saying these things gave them gravity, and in that gravity, the photograph on her bedside table stopped being just a picture and became a place where stories could be returned to. The presence that had shown itself in that kitchen morning remained a whispered part of her daily life. Sometimes Ana Clara would pause and press her palm to her shoulder where warmth had been felt, and she would whisper, "Thank you." She didn't elaborate or demand that others believe. It was simply how she marked something that had offered her solace in a time of erosion. The Bible remained on the side table, closed more often now, but not ignored. It had done no miracles, and nobody claimed it had. It had been a witness, and witnesses matter.
Rogerio's work at the house became a different kind of labor. He learned to stand between his daughter and the world when days grew sharp, and to listen when she wanted to tell the same small memory for the 100th time. Ana Clara was still small and still tender, but in the quietness of consistent presence, she began to stitch herself back together. Her forgiveness toward Patrícia was careful, offered, not coerced, conditional, not casual. It was a moral lesson that sometimes forgiveness is the start of restoration, and sometimes it is a boundary that must be guarded with wisdom. As months turned, there were small, ordinary moments that felt like grace. Ana Clara teaching Rogerio the way her mother used to knot a ribbon, a neighbor bringing over a loaf of bread and a shoulder to lean on, Patrícia calling to say she'd met with a counselor and naming the parts of herself she'd been ashamed to see. None of these were cinematic redemptions. They were the slow, ordinary kind that build human hearts back together. The community's response was a posture of protection rather than spectacle. People checked in, offered to pick Ana Clara up from school occasionally, and sat with Rogerio while he sorted insurance and appointments and the logistics of a household healing from a violation. There was accountability. A council of sorts, neighbors and close family, did not seek to judge beyond what dignity demanded. They sought to make sure boundaries were sustained and help was available. Once, in a small group gathered on the porch as twilight softened the town, someone asked Rogerio whether he believed that what had happened that morning was punishment or a sign. He looked out toward the dimming street and said, "It was a witness." He chose words carefully. Something witnessed what had been done, and that witnessing, whatever name you give it, moved people to see. It didn't strike anyone down. It invited us to take responsibility. That made the difference. Patrícia, when she came back after a period away, returned to a home that had been rearranged not only by new rules but by new loyalties. She greeted Ana Clara with distance at first, a respectful measure, but over time that distance softened. She sat in the living room and listened to stories she had once tried to cut away, bedtime rituals, favorite songs, small domestic myths of the family. She had to rebuild trust, and rebuilding trust is more work than breaking things is. She accepted that. She attended therapy, and quietly she began to volunteer at the town's small library where children gathered after school. It was not an act of penance aimed at prying open wounds, but a way to learn patience. On a late afternoon, some months after the cutting, the family stood for a moment before the photograph of Ana Clara's mother.
Rogerio opened the wooden box and allowed Ana Clara to hold the braid again, not to attempt to glue the past back to the present, but to let it fold into the family story as something honored. They placed the box on the shelf, and then sat with each other as the sky outside turned the color of old hymn pages. The narrator who watched the threads of the household together would say this: what happened that morning was not a miracle in the sense of an overturning of natural law. It was, instead, a small economy of attention redirected. Someone, or something, noticed. The noticing changed the people who were paying attention, and that change rippled into decisions. A father chose to protect, a woman chose to seek help, a town chose to hold rather than to smirk. Those were the true miracles, quiet and earned. There was a moment, months later, when Ana Clara stood before her father in the doorway of their kitchen. She had asked for scissors to trim a ragged edge of a ribbon she had attached to a notebook. Rogerio watched her hands, steadying,
and felt both the ache of the past and the softening present. She smiled a small, secret smile, one that belongs to children who have learned that memory need not be erased to live well. And then she leaned forward and kissed the photograph that still sat on the mantel. "We'll keep telling her stories," Rogerio said, and the house agreed. In the house's quiet interior, the presence that had once leaned close did not need to make a grand display. It continued to make itself known through the acts it inspired: people choosing care over control, accountability over convenience, presence over provision alone. This story does not end with a perfect reconciliation or with all wounds sealed. It ends with a daily choosing. Patrícia was not made whole overnight, nor was the family magically restored to innocence, but a line had been drawn. Children are to be defended. Those who harm, even in the name of good, must face help and consequences, and community must learn to hold the vulnerable with fierce tenderness. If any single image stayed with the town, it was Ana Clara's small hand closing over the braid in the wooden box, a gesture that said memory endures even when others try to erase it. The Bible remained on the table, sometimes open, sometimes closed, less as a source of spectacle and more as a companion, a reminder that someone notices the lowly, that attention can be a catalyst for change. For those watching this story and carrying similar wounds in their own homes, the lesson is practical and kind rather than preachy. Look, be present. When you see a child with a memory, honor it. When you discover harm, protect the vulnerable first. Encourage accountability and professional help for those who have hurt. Offer forgiveness when it is earned and safe, but keep boundaries that protect healing. This was what the presence, identified by some as Jesus, had done in a small kitchen. It had turned attention into action.
It had not punished through spectacle. It had urged humans to be what they were called to be, guardians of the fragile. If this story reminded you to stand with children who need protection, please like and subscribe, and share this message with someone who needs to hear that injustice does not go unnoticed.